All right, everyone. Welcome to episode 69 of the Rock Savages podcast. We've been gone for a little bit, but we are coming back with a vengeance in 2020, we have some interviews coming up that will be very, very interesting to y'all if you're into rock and roll and heavy metal and classic rock, blues, whatever. We talk about all of it and everything else too, everything going on in the world. It's what we do in podcast land. Now that I've let y'all know that we're back and we're coming back, episode 70 is coming next week, and then upward and onward, man. We're just going to keep trying to get this puppy down the road and keep getting some interesting content for y'all. And now that I made my reintroduction back into podcast land, we have Mr. Stephen Toe on for this episode to bring it back full force. Stephen is a rock and roll historian. He's an author. He teaches a class also on rock and roll. His website is stephentoe.com. His last book was called The Strangest Tribe, and it was about the Seattle music scene, which I have a little background in myself. His latest book is called London, Reign Over Me, after the Who song, it looks like. This book is very interesting. I've read the foreword in a couple chapters, and I'm trying to dig in when time permits. It's very interesting to me, and I'm sure it will be interesting to you if you're into the early '60s classic rock scene of England. And who isn't really? I mean, these bands, that came out of England in the '60s. It goes on and on. Pink Floyd, the Rolling Stones, Humble Pie, Eric Clapton. It just goes on and on and on. And Black Sabbath, of course. Can't forget Black Sabbath. And, it's a subject that I've read up on over the years here and there, but it's very interesting in that, some of these kids in the 60s, were heavily influenced by American blues. And so we kind of get into why that was the case, how it kind of happened, and what the new generation in the 60s, how, what they did with this blues influence and how they infused it in their own psychedelic rock and roll and beyond. It's a very interesting story. I hope you guys dig it. He did, like I said before, he did a book on the Seattle music scene, and before I even knew he wrote this book, when they sent me his new book, I kind of correlated in my mind, like the Seattle music scene and the London music scene. And we also get into that a little bit and how it kind of ties in together a little bit. Those the English bands of the 60s absolutely influenced some of the Seattle music that was coming out in the late 80s, mid 80s, and then early 90s. So it's interesting how these scenes changed the world of music forever. And, they were separated by miles and decades. And, they have some similarities in there, and it's kind of interesting. So we talk about that a little bit and beyond, on, the subject matter of London, Reign Over Me, Stephen Toe's new book, which will be available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and probably anywhere else you can find books February 15th. So that's next. It's coming up real soon, February 15th, 2020. I believe that's on a Saturday. So listen to this. Check it out, man. And if the subject matter interests you, then go buy the book, man. Support Stephen and his passion for rock and roll, man. That's why we're all here. And, do it, man. Do it. Go read a book, When's the last time you did that? It might have been yesterday, might have been 10 years ago. I don't know, but it's a damn good book from what I've read so far. I recommend it. And without further ado, I guess we'll just get into this episode, number 69 of the Rock Savages podcast with Stephen Toe, author of London, Reign Over Me and the Strangest Tribe. Right on. Shut up.
Hello, this is Steven.
Hi, Steven. This is Bo from the Rock Savages podcast. How are you?
Very well. How about yourself?
Not too bad. Where are you at? New York?
Philadelphia.
Oh, okay. I was close. That's cool. How is everything? How are you?
Doing very well. Yeah, I'm, trying to get ready for this book to come out and promote it. So,
That is on February 15th, 2020. We're talking about your new book, London Reign Over Me, correct?
Yes.
Very good. So I guess just give a little bit of an introduction to the folks who haven't heard of your previous work and your new work.
Just in terms of my first book, you mean, or?
Yeah, just who you are, your background in researching rock and roll, and your background as an author and whatnot.
Sure. I mean, the whole rock and roll thing started, of course, as we all do, as a fan. And been listening to that stuff my whole life. But seriously, I don't know, early 2000s started to get into researching the whole Seattle thing, where that all came from.
Right.
And that wasn't too long after I started teaching American history at this school I teach at now, Delaware Valley University. And I've done a bunch of classes there. So I kind of developed rock and roll history classes out of that, as things kind of time went along there. But I kind of initially got into writing about it. Well, I mean, just to give you a little bit about it, my background in terms of as a music fan, so I'm 57, okay?
Right.
So the Beatles broke up when I was 7, like literally. So I was like, I guess I'm considered a boomer, but I really don't consider myself one because I wasn't part of that whole 60s thing. I was too young.
Right.
I was always jealous of my older sister who was like, oh, my friend Wendy and I, we got Sgt. Pepper's right when it came out, and we had our minds blown, and the first Crosby, Stills, Nash record or whatever, and so by the time I came of age was like the late 70s, and like the mainstream had kind of gotten stale by then.
Sure.
And the high school I was in was kind of suburban, there wasn't, let's put it this way, there wasn't a lot of exposure. I didn't know that there was really cool stuff going on, like Gang of Four, Joy Division, or whatever, because
right.
they were all listening to the Grateful Dead.
Sure.
And so, and whatever. So everything like that, it's kind of weird because like if you look at like the late 70s, all these great bands had this like average records come out, every one of them,
Yeah.
Like, I mean, it's weird. Like, who are you? It's fine. It's okay. It's not who's next, or In Through the Out or Led Zeppelin. And it's all right, but it's not, Led Zeppelin 2 or Physical Graffiti or whatever.
Right.
Excuse me.
I think every band kind of goes through the ups and downs, kind of lulls in their career. Yeah.
But it was just that particular, in terms of collectively, it happened. Like I could probably name you 20 bands, 20 artists. Every single one of them put out these vital records in the late 60s, early 70s, and put out average records. So that was kind of my late 70s. So by the time the 80s rolled around, and that's when I was in college, that's when MTV really hit. And it changed. Everything became about the presentation. The music was sort of secondary. So, my friends would be talking about, how beautiful the girls were in the latest ZZ Top video, or
right.
how hot Madonna is or something. And I just kind of would look at them like, so the music's boring, stupid. Who cares?
Kind of stale. There's no depth to the recording. It's really they're getting into the digital era and things like that.
Yeah, it just wasn't like, I didn't find the music interesting. It didn't do anything for me, and so that's when I discovered the '60s and the '80s. That's when one of my roommate's girlfriends gave me Quadrophenia. I'd never heard it before. He says, "Here, listen to this." And I was like, wow.
Right.
And so that's when I got into The Who and the Stones, the Beatles, Hendrix, all them. So I just wanted to discover the 60s. So later on when Nirvana kind of blew up and all that in the 90s, then that became my 60s. I was still kind of young. And I was like, oh, cool, I got a 60s. And so I became obsessed with Seattle. Like, where did that all come from? And so I wrote my first book, The Strangest Tribe, and that came out in 2011.
Right.
And that just kind of traced, where it all came from. So for my next book, I just kind of went back to my own roots, and I was like, well, why don't we look at, that 60s era, and, I'm looking at London, same type of deal. Where did it come from? Why London? Why then? And that kind of led me to my current book.
Yeah, it's strange. I actually have a background. I was raised in Washington State, and I spent a couple years there. I wasn't raised my entire childhood, but I was out in the San Juan Islands in '88 and '89. My aunt is actually good friends with Bruce Pavitt, and it's strange. We'll get to the newest book, but it's strange because when I saw the title of your latest book that's coming out, for some reason I started thinking about the London scene in the '60s, but I had an immediate correlation to the Seattle music scene from the London scene. It was just a weird thought that I had. And I mean, there's definitely a correlation there in that I think maybe it's because these two cities had such great music scenes, even though it was, there was a distance between them two, with, the decades. But there's a correlation there, I think. And I've thought about this in the last couple of days, like between London and Seattle in some weird way, because I think the cities were kind of isolated and somewhat dark. From what the parts that I've read in your book so far, how the people that lived in London at the time describe it as post-war. It's kind of gloomy and dark, and I don't know. Seattle is kind of the same way with the weather. And what other elements do you think contributed to the hotbeds of some of the greatest rock and roll ever created within these scenes, go
ahead, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, Bruce Pavitt, he's actually going to talk to my class later on this semester by, via Skype.
Oh, that's awesome. So, I think I saw that on your website.
Yeah, so, I know him, and, he was really supportive of my first book, and, yeah, I mean, what kind of creates a great music scene? I think part of it is it cheap relatively for artists to live there?
Yeah, that's definitely an element for sure.
Right. I mean, New York and certainly even in London back then. Now, obviously, Seattle back then was real cheap to live in. Now it's like the most expensive place to live in America.
For sure, yeah. It was expensive back then. I mean, really. I mean, coming from Colorado, it's like, wow, a jar of peanut butter is like $9.
This was like you said, late '80s.
Yeah. I mean, the scene was already popping, but it wasn't in the mainstream yet. It was just getting there. I think Soundgarden had they were the first band to sign a major label with A&M, so it was just starting to pick up.
Yeah. So I think that's part of it. Obviously, you need a sort of a group of like-minded people that get together and just say we want to do something. And there is somewhat of a correlation between Seattle and London in the sense that you have this type of people. But I think the difference with Seattle was everybody left.
Right.
Like there's that famous billboard where the last person to leave Seattle, please turn out the lights. This is like, I don't know, 1977 or something.
Yeah, right. Because they're just way up there all by themselves. Nobody was going there as far as like bands touring and things like that. So they had to create their own scene, right?
Yeah, and people did. I mean, people left. Even musicians were like, "Well, there's nothing going on here, so let's go to San Francisco or L.A. or something, or New York or whatever, and try to make it." Most of them did, and the notable exception, of course, being Duff McKagan from Guns N' Roses. But
right.
But yeah, the people that stayed were more like, well, let's just, nobody cares about us. Nobody cares about us from New York. Nobody cares about us from London. Nobody cares about us from Los Angeles. We're never going to become famous or rich. Let's just make music to amuse ourselves, And that's what they did. And then they just broke all these rules of what you weren't supposed to do with punk rock. And then eventually, of course, it did evolve with the help of Sub Pop getting exposure. That it did create this big scene. But whereas London is London, they knew they were going there to get some. You couldn't even record anywhere back in the 60s in England unless you went to London.
Right.
So everybody went there, and there were opportunities. There were definitely opportunities to get gigs. There were lots of clubs. Seattle, there was like club opening, and then they would close every few months because the fire department would close it down, or the police would close it down. And
right.
So much. It was kind of a similar, I think, aesthetic of wanting to create, but it may be different. You know, there's no way you're going to make a career being in Green River, you know.
Right.
You know,
so they thought, you know, they probably could have in the 90s.
I mean, and then when it split off, of course, and, you know, that eventually became Pearl Jam, half the band, and it was like, oh, okay, yeah, I guess we can make money.
Oh, yeah, quite a bit of money. I mean, without we can move on to London now in the new book, but without giving away too much from the book, what's intriguing to me is how these British teenagers were exposed to American blues in the 1960s. And what's even weirder to me is that the not just blues music, but I think later what started creeping into the London music, the English rock bands, was the Middle Eastern sounds that they would use as an influence. I mean, Zeppelin did it, the Beatles did it, you know, with Love You Too. You know, in regards to Zeppelin, they kind of had a Middle Eastern backbeat, maybe with Kashmir, and then we had White Summer, Black Mountainside with the percussive stuff. That is this. It kind of blows my mind when you stop and think about it. I mean, of course, for younger people listening to this, of course, this is way pre-internet. They're not playing a lot of that stuff on the mainstream radio in Britain at the time, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, so it's almost a phenomenon that these kids and they were kids. I mean, we think of these artists now as like old men, but they were just teenagers back then, a lot of them. And they're listening to this Middle Eastern stuff, and then they're listening to American blues music, and it's like, how did you guys get your hands on this stuff? You know, it's crazy. It's like a crazy story.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, there's a folk musician by the name of Davy Graham who did a lot of traveling over to Africa, and was exposed into Asia and exposed to a lot of stuff, and came back and influenced a lot of people, and very, very subtly influenced people. But that sort of crept into the Kinks, and then of course the Beatles and Zeppelin. It all kind of, and Bert Jansch, who really was the guy that influenced Black Mountainside, White Summer, Black Mountainside. There were I think there was also that excitement, because you know how it is. It's like if it's not on, it wasn't on the BBC. They weren't playing anything like that until much later. You had to go find it, so it was like a little club. Cool, did you find out there's this Howlin' Wolf record? Really? Oh, that's neat. I mean,
right. It was pretty much like a word of mouth thing. It's almost like a underground punk rock feel,
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I was thinking about that with the Stones when they first started. Now, nobody thinks of the Stones as punk rock, right? They're the establishment, right?
Now, yeah,
right. But back then, they absolutely, and punk rock didn't exist, but they were punk rock before punk rock existed, because they were like, the ideal of punk rock is that anybody can get up and do it. You don't have to be, I don't know, a Juilliard graduate.
Correct. Yeah, you just need to know like 3 chords, and you're pretty much good.
Yeah, and people. They were up doing it, and all their their peers are like going down the crawdaddy to catch them. And they're like, man, they're just our age. They're doing it. Let's start a band. It's just like when the Ramones started,
Right.
Same thing.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's a kindred spirit of sorts, I guess. So tell me about the research of the book. How long did that take? And I'm sure you got to talk to a lot of different characters in the English scene. I mean, how does that kind of thing work on a project like this? Because I mean, how do you get a hold of all these people and get a chance to talk to them? I mean, did you get a chance to do like some face-to-face stuff, or was it mostly by phone or email? Or
as far as the process goes, I mean, man, it's just patience. I mean, because I don't come out of that sort of pipeline of I worked for Rolling Stone or Spin or Mojo or something like that, where I interviewed, I just had lunch with Elton John or something like that.
Right.
I
Yeah.
mean, so I just had to really just plug it and keep going after people for years, So
Oh, wow.
the book literally took, from the first interview till it's coming out is 7 years. So, which just happens to be about most of the period that I'm writing about.
Wow. Yeah. That's almost a decade, really.
So, yeah, it just took a long time. I think I'm sorry, I forgot the last part of your question.
Just like, well, I just kind of wanted to know. Well, you pretty much answered it. It's just like how the kind of process that this takes, like to gather all these interviews. It's like, geez, you pretty much answered it. It takes 7 years and a lot of perseverance. I understand just running a podcast. It's like when you want to talk to somebody, you just got to ask, and you got to ask a bunch and then follow up, and hopefully you can make it happen. But I guess writing a book is kind of different. It's a little more involved. It seems like a very in-depth subject that you could probably write another book with all of the stuff that you've gathered from it, I'm sure, after 7 years.
Yeah, it's just, do you want to explore different threads and things like that? But yeah, it's like you have to be persistent enough with people to be persistent but not too annoying.
Right, of course,
so,
yes. If they don't want to do it, it's like,
because there's nothing.
Sir.
Yeah, you respect them. They're not, whatever. I'm not going to help Peter Frampton's career at this point if he gets a couple quotes in my book. So he's not benefiting from it. So I have to respect that and hope that they'll talk to me.
Yeah, what's amazing, you mentioned Peter Frampton. I just saw him last summer, and one of his favorite projects was obviously Humble Pie for me. I mean, and it was the early Humble Pie stuff, and that obviously part of the London music scene on some level, I'm sure, with Steve Marriott and the rest. But what amazes me about some of those bands is you go back and you look at the footage, and they're like babies. They're like 17 years old, just shredding these really complex songs with these really interesting storylines within the lyrics. And it's like, how did you guys develop so quickly to where you're writing this kind of stuff? It blows my mind.
It is. It's funny because there's that you mentioned that the youth. I mean, you had like Fairport Convention. They were like 16, 17 years old when they made their first record, and and when Jimmy Page, the story, the Yardbirds all quit except for him, and he had to find a band, and so he was like, all right, I heard about this lead singer, this guy Robert Plant. He was in this band called Band of Joy. I don't know, whatever. So he went to check him out, and he's like, wow, this guy's great. And he's like, man, I can't believe he hasn't made it yet. And he's like, he was 19.
Yeah, just these little babies. I mean,
yeah. So yeah, you're right. It's just you kind of go, man, how could they do this at such a young age? But yeah, they just did it. I mean, what's Peter Noone doing in London at 16 years old? And he has his own flat, and hanging out with John Lennon, drinking Bacardis and Cokes,
It's just it's just mind blowing, man. I mean,
yeah.
Like to put it into perspective, the older you get, it's like what they must have done is just started playing an instrument at like 12 years old and just holed up in their room for years and never left. I guess that's how you get that good.
Well, a lot of them started out in skiffle bands, in the 50s.
That's right, and that's in the I believe it's in the foreword of your book there. Yeah, Jimmy Page was one of those guys.
Jimmy Page was one of them, and I mean, a lot of them were, most of them. I mean, John Lennon, Jimmy Page, Ray Davies, all of them were, in skiffle bands. So they kind of started that, and most of them were just kind of self-taught. There were some of the proggy people were more, trained, of course, but yeah, they just started at a really young age and and skiffle was like punk rock because it was just, you can just start a band.
Yeah.
And you don't need any money.
Right. Right. You're not going to be famous. You just have fun,
Yeah, exactly, and maybe get a couple girls. That'd be kind of cool too. And
yeah.
and but then eventually, as when the '60s start to come in, and then now you could kind of get some gigs, and you could actually make a little bit of money. You could afford some better equipment, and technology's getting better. And yeah, they started to get more experimental with the music, and they just kind of went in different directions.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a fun game to play. It's like, you know what, like, I don't know what your next project will be, but this is kind of off topic a little bit. Like, it's when I hear like Midnight Rider from the Allman Brothers, I tell everyone in the room, I was like, you know, that's a 19-year-old kid singing that song. I mean, it sounds like an old ass man, you know. But you know, it's one of those things. And speaking of which, what's on the docket for your next project? Are you going to do another music related thing, or move on to something
Probably.
else?
I mean, I'm kind of just I'm kicking around a couple of ideas. I mean, the joke with my wife and I is about like just I'll find a city and then write a book about how a bunch of people did stuff, like a city I like, right? So,
Right.
you know, I like London, I like Seattle, you know, I don't know, Prague.
Oh shit, yeah. Hey man, I mean, we're from the Cleveland area, so there's a rich rock and roll history here, so you could always dig into
Sure.
that life, you know, and check that out for sure. I mean, it goes so deep. There's so much history here, so there's a recommendation for you there. All right, Stephen, thank you for talking to us. The book is called London Reign Over Me, and that is out February 15th of 2020, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Is there any parting comments you'd like to let everybody know about?
I guess just the book really, and I think you found when you read it, it's not a lot of rock books really delve into pretty much every one of them gets into the excesses, the drugs, who got laid, Led Zeppelin dropping TV sets out of the window.
Sure, absolutely.
And that's fine. It's just been done, and I really want it. This book really is just about the music, and it's also, I mean, you know, there's some, you know, Keith Moon stories in
Absolutely,
there,
yeah.
and
you can't deny the drama. You know, there's got to be
yeah,
something.
yeah. There's crazy stuff that I talk about in the book, but it's not. I guess it's not so much of like stressing the bad behavior or the debauchery as much as it is just like, okay, well, these are still young kids having fun, but it mostly just looks at, you know, at the music. And I think like books like, let's say, Keith Richards' Life, which is one of the few rock, like say, autobiographies that I actually read all the way through and went, oh, okay. Not usually I kind of get to the point where they get famous and I go, oh, this is boring. Oh, they're going to get another Bentley. They're going to, you know, oh, somebody died in the band because they overdosed, or, you know, whatever, right?
Right.
So it's a lot more, you know, I like that kind of stuff that's just sort of like, you know, I don't know, Brian Auger, who nobody knows who he is. He's a keyboard player. He's played with everybody from Jimmy Page to Judy Garland, you know.
Right.
Incredibly talented. One of the few people that Keith Emerson complimented.
Oh, geez. Yeah. Sure.
But anyway, he just told, you know, oh, yeah, you know, I got in on this session with the Yardbirds, are friends of mine. Hey, want to do a single? Okay, all right. He's a keyboard player. He plays piano and organ. Walks in, he's like, hey, where's the piano? I don't know. Where's the organ? There's no organ. Well, what am I going to play? Oh, this thing. What is it? The harpsichord. Are you out of your mind? I know how to do that. Why? Who's going to buy a single with a harpsichord on it? You know.
Right.
And you know, and that became For Your Love, and it became a huge hit for them. But stuff like that, I like that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think you hit it right on the head there. I mean, yeah, I think especially in today's age, like people are chasing the fame and the money thing a lot. But I mean, this is kind of a cautionary tale, and you see that a lot in rock and roll, where if you're chasing fame, it's going to distract you. I mean, everybody needs some money to create, I guess, but I mean, it's refreshing to hear that you're writing from the musical standpoint of it, because that actually is the funnest part, and that's why all of us are here, and that's why all of us are talking about it and love this stuff. It's not really the fame. You're right. It gets boring. The story's the same over and over again, and when you get too famous and too rich, the art usually starts to suck. Generally.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was at a client of mine, his lady's daughter. I do consulting, financial consulting. That's basically what pays the bills. But she, her daughter was there. She was like, I don't know, 20, something like that. And she's really into a lot of this older music. We were having an argument over the best Led Zeppelin album, and I was like, man, I feel like I was back in high school.
Yeah,
you know,
that's fun. That's the fun stuff, man.
Yeah.
It's Led Zeppelin 3 or Physical Graffiti, by the way. You need to let them know.
She was going Physical Graffiti. I was always partial to 2. So
yeah, they're all great. I love them all.
Yeah, they really are. So you know, I don't think you can really go wrong with that. But that's the fact that you got young people walking around wearing Pink Floyd shirts and Led Zeppelin, Hendrix shirts because it's still because of the music, not because of the other stuff.
They know deep down what the good stuff is. It gets down into your biology, really. I mean, and it doesn't leave, you know.
It doesn't. It's just it touches your soul. That's what it does, and that's what makes the difference, and that's why it's still relevant, and that's why people still dig it. You know.
Hell yeah, and the recordings are so rich, and they were done right, and it sounds like music, you know.
Yeah, I mean, it was 3-4 years ago now. Steve Howe from Yes did a little Skype session with my class. So on the way to class, I listened to the Yes album for the first time in a while. So that came out like 1970. Yeah. I'm like, man, it still sounds fantastic. It's incredibly good.
Yeah.
You know.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I just a couple years ago I bought the Led Zeppelin reissues. A lot of audiophiles would probably yell at me for that, but they sound so good. I've never heard the band sound that good before. Jimmy Page oversaw the whole remastering process, and they put it on 180 gram. And man, those records were recorded so well back then. I mean, you can hear every cymbal decay. I mean, we can nerd out on this forever, but that's the kind of stuff that should matter, you know. On a certain level.
And what's great too about those early Zeppelin records is there's mistakes on them, and he just left them because they're human. I mean, you're going to make mistakes, and it's like when you have everything digitized so that nobody's ever off key on any note. Well, that you take the humanity out of it.
That's exactly right, man. I mean, I'm a musician too, and I've done several records with all my buddies here in Ohio, and that's what I always press. I was like, let's not do a click track. Let's let the beat speed up and slow down just as we're playing it, because that's how we do it live, and that's what makes it interesting to me. You know, I don't want it to be perfect, and I don't want to listen to perfect music, you know, because I want to listen to humans making music, you know, and I think that's what these kids are tapping into.
They are. I mean, even with the grunge thing. I mean, you know, Jack Endino, who was the grunge producer in all those bands, and that's his philosophy. You know, no more than, you know, by the time you get to the 10th take, they got the notes, they're playing it perfect, but there's no soul left. So, you know, leave the mistakes in, and obviously you don't want it to sound like crap, but you know, there's a balance there. But yeah, I think that's really that's what makes it. You know, my daughter actually asked me. She says, you know. Are you okay with, like, I don't know, the kind of the effects that they use in music and technology? And I had to think about it, and I was like, you know, you can't not use technology. You know, that's great. I mean, where's the point where it's too much? I don't know. Like, I really like that Billie Eilish record. You know, I dig it.
Right.
It's weird, and it's all kinds of weird effects, but it's dark and it's clever, and the lyrics are clever, and so, you know, I don't know. It's good.
Yeah, I mean, you know. Dave Grohl kind of hit it on the head too with his documentary Sound City. It's like there's a dichotomy in talent and technology, and there's a balance in there somewhere, and you kind of got to find it. Yeah, for sure. All right, my man. Thank you again for talking to us. This was an awesome conversation. It was a lot of fun. And if you ever have any other projects you want to talk to us about, feel free to let us know, and we'll get back to you and have another conversation. We could probably sit down and do a whole other podcast about whatever. We could just talk about random rock and roll, and it would go on and on and on.
We could. I mean, even just real quick. I mean, just like. I was thinking of Jack Endino, and he was working with Tony McPhee from the Groundhogs, who I interviewed for my London book. So there's this weird connection there. That's exactly what I thought, and this is before I even looked you up. I was like, there's a connection with Seattle and the English stuff. Well, I'm sure a lot of those guys were influenced by absolutely Black Sabbath and Zeppelin for sure. I mean. They all were, and even people don't talk about the psych thing in Seattle enough, and there was a lot of psych influence, and they were all into a lot of the weird psyche bands coming out of, well, obviously the West Coast U.S., but also coming out of England. So yeah,
crazy. It's just a human connection of some kind. I think we're all aware of it on some level. But okay, man, thank you very much. Again, the book is called London Reign Over Me. It will be out February 15th, 2020. I will be sure to have this episode out before that, just so we can get it bumped up a little bit if we can. So thanks again, man. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Bill.
Thanks. Talk to you later. Bye.
Bye-bye.